The magic of 7th chords for jazz and beyond. Return of the music theory hat. Today I'm wearing my music theory hat to do a quick overview of 7th chords, what they are, how they can be used, and why they're important for jazz and jazz-adjacent styles. Such as the type of smooth, sophisticated light rock of the late 70s and early 80s that has come to be known as yacht rock, despite what Donald Fagen thinks of the label, but that's for a future video. Actually, this whole video is for that future video, so I'll have this one to refer back to in that one. And through the magic of YouTube, once that video is finished, I'll come back and add a link to it in the upper right corner. Right there. Okay, let's get on with it. But first, a disclaimer. Actually, two disclaimers. Disclaimer number one. It's December, and I'm in Minneapolis. It's 15 degrees outside, and my orange padded room is right next to our furnace. It's not fair to the rest of my family to turn the heat off just to make this video, so I apologize if you hear rumbling in the background. Disclaimer number two. Talking about music theory on the internet is a fool's errand. If I omit something, someone's going to assume I don't know it. But I probably do, I just don't want this video to be 10 hours long. Conversely, the Dunning-Kruger effect is rarely as evident as in online music theory discussions. The less someone knows, the more likely they are to think they know it all. But who's who? Who knows? Alright, now let's get on with it. What's a 7th chord? Well, first off, what's a chord? Quite simply, it's 3 or more notes played together. Generally, those are 3 notes from a particular scale, and they're typically stacked in thirds, skipping every other note of the scale. The most basic chord, called a triad, is 3 notes, the root, third, and fifth of the scale. In both major and minor scales, the 5th degree is a perfect fifth, so the only difference between the major and minor chords is the third. We have, of course, a major third and a minor third, which is a half step lower. So far, so good. But what if we add a 4th note to the chord? Assuming we once again skip the next note, we add the 7th. Now it's jazz. Just like with the third, you can have a major or minor 7th, depending on which scale you're using, and which scale degree you're starting on for the root of the chord. Since the root and 5th are the same in both major and minor, the 3rd and 7th become the notes that define the character or color of a chord. In a jazz setting, with the bass covering the root, and the 5th often simply omitted, the piano or guitar might really just focus on the 3rd and 7th notes of the chord. To keep things simple for this video, I'm going to talk about everything in terms of the C major scale and its relative A natural minor scale. That way, there are no sharps or flats in any of the diatonic notes. Diatonic means the notes in the scale. Let's talk about the 5 most common types of 7th chords. Major 7th. An example in our key would be the C major 7 chord. C, E, G, B. That's both a major 3rd and a major 7th. Minor 7th. An example in our key would be the A minor 7 chord, A, C, E, G. That's both a minor 3rd and a minor 7th. Dominant 7th. An example in our key, starting on the 5th degree of the C major scale, is a G7 chord, G, B, D, F. Here we have the major 3rd but the minor 7th. This creates a tritone interval between the 3rd and the 7th, which gives it some special properties we'll talk about more in a minute. It's called the dominant 7th because it's the chord built on the dominant scale degree, the 5th. Both the term dominant and the fact that this is kind of the default 7 chord, we don't need to say it's a minor 7 or a major 7, just a 7, have to do with older Western music predating jazz. Again, more on that in a minute. Half diminished, or minor 7 flat 5. An example in our scale is B minor 7 flat 5, B, D, F, A. Diatonically, this chord only occurs on the 7th degree of the scale. It's the only diatonic chord that doesn't have a perfect 5th. The 5th is a half step lower, so we have a tritone with the root. At this point, you may have noticed some relationships between chords a third apart. And here's where I could start talking about chord inversions, 9th chords, 6th chords, chord substitutions, altered chords, etc. Please just refer back to my disclaimer at the beginning, and we'll move on, because there's one more 7th chord I want to mention. Minor major seventh. If we changed our example scale from A natural minor to A harmonic minor, we can get this chord building from A, C, E, G sharp. This is the odd one out because it doesn't occur naturally in a standard major or minor scale, but it does occur in both the harmonic and melodic minor scales. It has a very mysterious quality, and it's sometimes called the James Bond chord because it was famously used as the ending chord of the James Bond theme. So what is dominant, and what makes it that way? Seventh chords were not very common in Western classical music prior to the Romantic period in the 19th century. The exception was dominant seventh chords, used as a part of a resolution to the tonic. It all has to do with how chords tend to flow one into the next. There are three main ways the ear wants to hear notes move between chords: stepwise, half or whole steps, but especially half steps or chromatically, or by moving around the circle of fourths. Wait, I said three ways. The third is just staying put. One or more common tones between chords helps them feel related, and the transition between them to be smooth. So, a common tendency in chord progressions, both in older Western classical music and in jazz, is to have the root of the chords move around the circle of fourths, while simultaneously creating as much stepwise movement as possible in the other notes. Possibly the most common cadence, or ending sequence of chords, in Western music, and especially in jazz, is the 2-5-1. It's the last three chords moving around the circle of fourths, arriving back at the root. Your composition can meander wherever it wants, but when the ear hears this cadence, it feels like it's coming home, resolving. In our key of C major, this cadence would be a D minor chord to a G major chord to a C major chord. That's a pretty nice movement from G to C. You have the fourth in the roots, but you also have a lot of stepwise movement. The B moves up a half step to C, and the D moves a whole step to E. And of course, G stays right where it is. Because the 5 chord feels a pull back to the root, it's called the dominant. That is, it's the most dominant chord amongst all in the scale at driving the movement back to home base. Eventually, composers in the classical period got a bit more daring with their chords, and they discovered that by adding the 7th degree on the dominant chord, they could create an even stronger pull. Now, with the G7 chord, there's also an F that wants to move down by a half step to the E in the C chord. The dominant 7th chord also creates an added layer of tension by way of the tritone between its 3rd and 7th degrees. It feels unsettled and strongly wants to resolve to that root chord. What about the harmonic and melodic minor scales again? I understand why elementary school band teachers don't get heavily into music theory, but I feel like there's a disconnect. I remember practicing harmonic and melodic minor scales in my 5th grade clarinet lessons, but those scales never really got talked about much after that. It's a shame because understanding how those get used and how they lead to chord substitutions and secondary dominance can be really useful. You might notice that the 5 chord in a natural minor scale is also minor. In our case, the 5 chord in A natural minor is E minor, E, G, B. But as we saw with the major scale example, the major 3rd in the 5 chord is the note that most strongly pulls back to the tonic. So what if we just substituted an E major chord in place of E minor? Then we'd have a G sharp, which would really pull back to that A. Well, why not? Classical composers started putting major 5 chords in their minor key compositions, and the harmonic minor scale was born. As for the melodic minor, well, they didn't like that huge jump harmonic minor introduced between the 6th and 7th degrees, so they raised the 6th on the way up, and lowered both on the way down. Well, if you can change a note in one chord, then... That's right, raising the 3rd of the 5 chord of a minor key opened the floodgates. The 2 chord in a 2-5-1 is normally minor, but you can make that major too, and stick a 7th on it. Now it's called a 5-7-5, or a secondary dominant. Here's where the magic happens, and kind of the whole point I thought I was going to get to quickly in this video. You can just string together a series of dominant 7th chords going around the circle of fourths forever. Secondary dominants on top of secondary dominants. And since jazz musicians love to go on forever, it's perfect. Sorry, I'll show myself out. But seriously, this property is one of two things I think are truly magical about a dominant 7th chord. As I indicated earlier, the 3rd and the 7th are the most important notes for defining the color of a chord. Now watch what's possible when you play roots around the circle of fourths in your left hand while playing the 3rd and 7th in your right hand. That's right, I'm able to just play the same interval, a tritone, in the right hand, moving down by a half step with each chord. Doing this is inverting which note is on top. With the C chord, the 7th is on top, with F it's the 3rd, with B flat it's the 7th again, etc. But the voicing of the notes in the right hand doesn't change what the chord is. It just provides a very natural and fluid way to step between the chords. What other magic does the tritone contain? Yes, there's one other piece of magic with dominant 7th chords and their curious tritone interval. It's called Tritone Substitution. This is a term I heard thrown around a lot when I was learning about jazz, but it was never explained to me, and it's actually really simple. Because the notes that provide the most color in a chord are the 3rd and the 7th, and because those notes are a tritone apart in a dominant 7th chord, each dominant 7th chord has a counterpart, the chord where the positions of the same 3rd and 7th are swapped. As it happens, those counterparts' root notes are a tritone apart themselves. Jazz musicians discovered they could swap one of these chords for its counterpart and add interesting chromatic color to their compositions without significantly altering the overall harmonic flow. What's really cool about these chords is that the root goes from being the 5th degree of the tonic to being a half step above the tonic. So not only do you get your normal 2-5-1 cadence flow, but you have an additional chromatic movement. What was previously a D minor to G7 to C progression can become a D minor to D flat 7 to C progression. The middle chord still retains both the F and the B, although if you're a stickler, it's going to be the enharmonic equivalent C flat, pulling to E and C. But now you also have a chromatic stepwise pattern in the roots, which, well, it just sounds really cool. This opens a lot of doors for unexpected key changes too, because you could treat the existing dominant 7th chord as a tritone substitution and resolve it to a whole new tonic instead of the expected one. How does D minor to G7 to F sharp major sound? Conclusion. Well, this went a lot farther than I expected it to, and it still barely scratched the surface. I'm just hopeful that it sheds some light on things that honestly seem pretty natural and intuitive once you understand them, but that for some reason were never communicated to me that way in my education, even when I spent 2 years studying music theory in college. And now, time to get to work on that yacht rock video.